All right, well, welcome back. This is the last video for today. So in this video, I will show you how to turn your histogram into a frequency polygon. So remember, you're going to use a frequency polygon when you have a continuous variable and you want to compare your data to the normal distribution. And that way you compare a line graph to a line graph. Don't forget, you're going to find two files below. One is going to be the data spreadsheet that we'll use, and the other is a step-by-step directions document on how to make a frequency polygon. So I pulled up our Excel spreadsheet, also our Word document on frequency graphs. This first part, again, is for histograms. I'm actually going to scroll all the way down to where it talks about frequency polygons, so this small section right here. You notice when you open up that spreadsheet, it's just a continuation of where we left off with the histogram. I highly recommend that whenever doing a frequency polygon, you do a histogram first, and at the very end, convert it into a frequency polygon. You can create a frequency polygon from scratch from your original data, but it actually is harder and takes longer than if you were to just create a histogram first and then convert it at the very end. So that's my advice to you. Create your histogram, and once you have your histogram, convert it over into your frequency polygon or into your line graph. So here we go. We have our histogram here. Let's go to our Word document. We're going to right-click on our histogram. We're going to click on the Design tab. We're going to click Change Chart Type. And we're going to select the chart that's lines with markers. And this is going to be our fourth option in that drop-down menu. And so we'll take a look at that. So let's do that first. Let's go back to our spreadsheet here. I'm going to click on our histogram. You notice at the very top, we have our chart tabs. I want to go to the one that says Design. And I want to change chart type. I'll go down to right below column. You're going to see line charts. I want to do that one. And then the fourth option over is going to be our line with markers. That's the one that we want. And notice it gives you a preview in the window there as well. So I'm going to click that one. We're going to click OK. And that's going to turn our histogram into a frequency polygon. So you'll notice that if you're looking at our frequency polygon, you'll notice that the lines are not touching the x-axis. That's going to indicate to the viewer that I have sample data. So when I have sample data, I'm not measuring the entire population. That means I could have values that's less than my midpoint of 3.85, or I could have values that's higher than my midpoint of 73.15. And that wouldn't be reflected here in our graph. So you can imagine that there could be a AU student out there, an Auburn University student out there, who's spending like $200 on coffee in a week. Well, they're not here presented in our graph, but we want to infer to all AU students. So in that case, we would indicate to the viewer that we have sample data, we haven't measured the entire population, and there could be values that's lower or higher than what's presented in our graph. So let's say for a second, what if we had population data? What if we measured all the students at Auburn University, all 25,000 some odd of them, and asked them the question about how much they spend on coffee in a week? Well, if that was the case, then we would need to take this graph and change it so that the line is now connected to the x-axis. And when we connect it to the x-axis, we tell the viewer that we have measured everything, every observation in that population, and that there's no other values to consider when looking at this particular graph. So let's go over to our Word document to find out how we do that. And so that's the second step under frequency polygon. So if we have population data, then we need to include two more midpoints, one before our first midpoint, another one after our last midpoint. And we'll keep the frequency count 0 so that it connects it to the x-axis. So to do that, we're going to click on the very first midpoint that represents an interval. And then we're going to click on Filter. And then we're going to clear the filter for the variable, in this case coffee, from our table. So in the spreadsheet, we're going to right-click on that very first midpoint. We're going to go down to Filter, and we're going to click the Clear Filter from Coffee variable. And notice that when we do that, it adds back in that very first row and that very last row that we hid with the histogram. And so you'll notice that in the actual chart, it's now connected. Those dots are now touching the x-axis. our line is no longer hovering, so our frequency polygon is telling the viewer that we have accounted for all the data in the population. So the very last thing we need to do is we need to put in values for this midpoint that connects to the x-axis on the left side, and another value over here on the right side. So to do that, we're going to go back to our table. Remember, in this case, our interval width was 7.7. We're going to take 3.85 and we're going to subtract 7.7 from it. That's going to give us our very first midpoint. And then we're going to take 73.15 and we're going to add 7.7, and that's going to give us this last midpoint. So in this particular case, if we take 3.85 and we subtract 7.7, we're going to get negative 3.85. So to put that in place of our very first row, and notice that that's going to change my graph. So now it says negative 3.85. That's the next midpoint below the midpoint that has data in it. Then we're going to go to this very last row, and we'll take 73.15. I'm going to add 7.7 to it. That's going to give me 80.85. And then notice that it changes also in my graph. And so now I have midpoints for every single point on my graph. And that's going to be a frequency polygon that we showed, a frequency polygon for a sample as well as for a population. Please remember to save your spreadsheet and your name as the file name and then submit below. And then make sure you practice these steps a lot. Again, like I mentioned before in the last video, that you'll have to do this from memory for the exam. And so make sure you can do it. Make sure you have that motor memory so it's second nature.